Welcome to Libyth. Today we are in Heian, Japan, and today we are not talking about poems at all. Not yet. Today we are talking about the room the poems were written in, the room being the entire structure of Heian society, the system of power and obligation and inheritance that produced the kind of people who would sit down and write 31 syllables about a falling cherry blossom and mean something enormous by it. You cannot understand why the Kokinshu looks the way it looks until you understand the pressure it was written under. And pressure is the right word, because what we are going to walk through today is not background information. It is a structure that is actively pulling itself apart, while it produces some of the most refined literary culture in Japanese history. Keep that paradox in your hands as we go, because it never resolves. It only gets sharper. Start with the most basic question any political order has to answer. Where does authority come from, and why does anyone agree to obey it? In Heian, Japan, the formal answer was simple and on paper, totally clean. Authority came from the emperor. The emperor was the sacred center of the realm, the figure around whom the entire administrative apparatus of the state was organized, the person whose name appeared on every formal commission, every decree, every act of state, including, as we discussed last time, the commissioning of an entire anthology of poetry meant to define what Japanese aesthetic identity even was. That is the formal structure. Sacred emperor, divinely legitimated at the center of everything. Now hold that formal structure up against what was actually happening on the ground, because the gap between the two is where everything interesting in this period lives. By the middle of the 9th century, a single aristocratic family, the Fujiwara, had figured out something quietly devastating. You do not need an army to control a country if you control who the emperor marries, and more importantly, who the emperor's mother is. The mechanism was called Second Seiji, regency government, and it worked through a deceptively simple move repeated generation after generation. Marry a daughter into the imperial line. Wait. When the resulting child becomes emperor, especially if he becomes emperor young, as many of these emperors did, install yourself as his regent, his sessho if he is a minor, his kanpaku, his chief advisor if he is older but still pliable. You are now governing in his name, with his seal, through his bureaucracy, without ever needing to seize anything by force, because nothing has been seized. It has been married into. Notice what this does structurally. It does not abolish the formal hierarchy. It does not replace the emperor or contradict the principle that authority flows from the throne. It hollows the hierarchy out from inside while leaving its outer shape completely intact. The emperor still sits at the center. The decrees still bear his name. The rituals still center him as a sacred figure. But the actual content of decision-making, the actual direction of policy, the actual distribution of patronage and office, increasingly flows through whichever Fujiwara household happens to be supplying the current empress or the current regent. This is the first thing you need to hold on to, because it is going to recur in every layer of the system we are about to walk through. Formal legitimacy and actual control have started to separate, and once they separate, every other structure built on top of that gap inherits the same instability, whether anyone intends it to or not. Push on this a little further, and you start to see why this particular mechanism, marriage rather than force, was so effective and also so corrosive over time. A conquest can be reversed. A usurpation can be challenged on the grounds that it broke the rules. But what rule, exactly, Was the Fujiwara breaking by marrying their daughters well? None. They were playing entirely within the formal structure, using the very mechanism the structure relied on, kinship and succession, to bend that structure toward their own household's interests. This is a system being defeated by its own logic rather than by an external attack, and that distinction matters enormously, because it means the instability is not an accident that befell Heian Japan from outside. It is generated from within the legitimating structure itself. Every emperor needs an heir. Every heir needs a mother. Every mother comes from a family. And if one family becomes structurally indispensable to that chain, generation after generation, then that family does not need to overthrow the emperor. It only needs to keep supplying mothers. Now widen the frame, because power never stays contained to the question of who controls succession. It radiates outward into the actual machinery of administration, and here the gap between form and substance opens even further. The formal government of Heian Japan was, on paper, a direct inheritance from Chinese models adopted generations earlier during the Nara period. A centralized bureaucracy, organized along Chinese administrative lines, with ranks, offices, and a notional capacity to tax and govern the entire realm from a single administrative center. That center was Heian itself, the capital, laid out on a grid modeled on Chinese urban planning, with the imperial palace positioned at its heart, both literally and symbolically. The place where ceremony and governance were supposed to be the same activity performed in the same space. On paper, this is a coherent, centralized, rationally organized state. In practice, by the time the Kokinshu is being compiled, that centralized bureaucratic machinery is increasingly a shell occupied by a hereditary aristocracy whose actual claim to office rests not on administrative competence, not on examination, not on merit in any meaningful operational sense, but on lineage. There was, technically, a civil service examination system, borrowed in spirit from the much more rigorous Chinese model. But it functioned as a pale shadow of its counterpart across the sea, easily overridden by the overwhelming weight of hereditary privilege. If your family held high rank, you held high rank. If your family did not, no amount of demonstrated ability was going to move you very far. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how a formal system, even a well-designed one, gets quietly repurposed by the people operating inside it. The administrative offices remain. The titles remain. The rituals of appointment remain. But the substance of who actually occupies those offices and why has shifted entirely onto a separate logic, the logic of inherited family status, that the formal bureaucratic structure was never actually designed to serve, and was certainly not designed to be captured by. And once you see that capture happening at the level of office holding, you can already predict, almost mechanically, what is going to happen at the level of land and revenue, because the same underlying dynamic, formal structure increasingly hollowed by private accumulation, plays out there with even starker consequences. The original Chinese-derived system assumed that land, broadly speaking, belonged to the state, which then allocated it, taxed it, and drew its revenue and its capacity to govern from that taxation. This was the substance behind the formal centralized bureaucracy, a state that could actually fund itself. But across the Heian period, a parallel system of private landholding, the Shun, the tax-exempt estate, expanded steadily and relentlessly, eating into exactly that public domain. The mechanism here, is almost elegant in its destructiveness. A landowner, often a local cultivator or a minor official, finds it advantageous to donate or commend their land to a powerful aristocratic house or to a major Buddhist temple, because that donation buys tax-exempt status. The state loses a taxable unit of land. The aristocratic house or temple gains an estate, and the local cultivators who actually work that land become tenants, paying rent not to the state, but to whatever private hand now holds the deed, tied to that land in a relationship of obligation that has nothing to do with the formal apparatus of imperial administration. Multiply that single transaction across the entire breadth of the country, repeated over and over for generations, and you get something close to a slow-motion transfer of the substance of state power, namely the capacity to extract resources and direct them, away from the formal center and into the hands of a private aristocratic and religious elite. The state does not collapse in any dramatic, visible sense. There is no single moment where anyone could point and say, "Here, this is where it broke." Instead, there is a long, cumulative erosion, where every individual decision to commend a piece of land to a powerful patron is locally rational, even attractive. And yet the aggregate effect across thousands of such decisions is a central government increasingly starved of the very revenue base that would let it function as a central government in anything but name. And once the state has been starved of that revenue, what does it do? It does not have an independent option. It becomes more, not less, dependent on the very aristocratic households that are absorbing its tax base, because those are now the households with the actual resources, the actual local control, the actual capacity to deliver anything that needs delivering. The hollowing of the center does not produce a vacuum that the center can simply fill by trying harder. It produces an inverted dependency, where the formal sovereign becomes structurally reliant on the private actors who have been quietly draining its substance. This is the moment to step back and notice the shape of the argument we have built so far, because the shape itself is the point. We started with the most abstract question, where does authority come from, and found a formal answer, the sacred emperor, increasingly contradicted by an actual answer, whichever family currently supplies the imperial mothers. We moved to government organization and found the same pattern. A formal Chinese-style bureaucracy increasingly occupied and directed by hereditary privilege rather than the administrative logic it was built to serve. We moved to land and revenue and found the same pattern again, intensified. A formal public tax base being quietly converted, transaction by transaction, into private aristocratic and religious wealth, leaving the state dependent on exactly the actors who had captured its resources. A widening gap between what the system claims to be and what it actually is. A gap that does not stay contained, but spreads. Because every domain in a society is connected to every other domain. And a hollowing at the level of political legitimacy was always going to metastasize into administration and economy, because political legitimacy is what is supposed to give administration and economy their coherence in the first place. Now let's go even more concrete, because abstractions about power and administration only tell you part of the story. They tell you what is happening to institutions. They do not yet tell you what is happening to people, to the actual lived units of family, household, and community that this entire structure is built out of. And it is here, at the most granular level, that the logic of the whole system becomes almost uncomfortably visible. Consider the family, not as an abstract sociological category, but as the literal mechanism through which the entire power structure we have just described actually operates. Marriage in Heian aristocratic society was not a private arrangement between two people building an independent household. It was, at the upper levels of the aristocracy at least, a deliberate instrument of political strategy, and the family that perfected this instrument most ruthlessly was, again, the Fujiwara. A few decades after the Kokinshu's compilation, a single Fujiwara patriarch would manage to have 4 of his daughters married into the imperial family simultaneously, a degree of saturation that gave him a level of control over the court that approached something like total. We are looking slightly past the anthology's own moment here, but the trajectory was already fully visible and already accelerating at the time the Kokinshu was being compiled, which is exactly why it matters. The anthology is not produced in a moment of political stability that later degrades. It is produced inside an already active, already intensifying process of exactly this kind of dynastic capture. And notice what this does to the very concept of family as a structural unit. In a system where marriage is the primary lever of political control, the family stops being simply a kinship unit and becomes something closer to a strategic asset class. Daughters become instruments of alliance. Sons inherit not personal achievement, but positional advantage, rank and access calibrated entirely by which household they were born into. The family, in other words, is not a neutral, pro-political institution sitting quietly beneath the level of high politics. It is the actual operating mechanism of high politics, which means that any instability at the level of dynastic competition between great houses does not stay contained within politics in some narrow sense. It runs straight through the household, because the household is the unit competition is fought through. Widen out one more step, from family to the larger aggregations of clan and community, and the same logic holds, now at a slightly different scale. Clan prestige in Heian, Japan was, like office holding, like land tenure, like everything else we have discussed, fundamentally inherited rather than earned. The Fujiwara name carried weight not because any individual Fujiwara had personally demonstrated extraordinary administrative or military skill, but because the name itself, accumulated over generations of strategic marriage and successful regency, had become a kind of self-sustaining capital. Status bred access, access bred further marriages bred further status, in a closed loop that had almost nothing to do with competence and almost everything to do with position within an already existing hierarchy of inherited prestige. And at the level of community, the same centralizing, status-concentrating logic produced a strikingly lopsided geography. Heian, the capital, grew into something close to the only place in the entire country that genuinely mattered. A city that may have reached a population approaching 100,000 at its height, a staggering concentration for the period, functioning simultaneously as the political center, the religious center, and the cultural center of the realm, all stacked on top of each other in the same urban space. Everything that conferred status, refinement, access to patronage, access to poetic and aesthetic prestige, access to the imperial court itself, existed inside that single city. The provinces, by contrast, were where you were sent when you had fallen out of favor, where administrative duty took you when you had no better option, where exile happened. This is not incidental to the Kokinshu's content. It is precisely why the entire book devoted to travel poetry in the anthology carries such a consistent undertone of melancholy and displacement, rather than anything resembling adventure or discovery. To leave the capital was not to go exploring. It was to be removed from the only place where being someone was actually possible, And the poetry written under those conditions registers that removal as something close to a small bereavement, a separation from the center of meaning itself. So now look at everything we have assembled, and notice that it forms a single continuous structure rather than a list of separate facts. Authority is formally centered on the emperor, but actually channeled through whichever family controls succession. Administration is formally a rational, centralized bureaucracy, but actually occupied by hereditary privilege detached from administrative function. Land and revenue are formally public, but actually leaking, transaction by transaction, into private and religious hands that the state becomes increasingly dependent on rather than able to discipline. Family is formally a kinship unit, but actually functions as the operating mechanism of dynastic political competition. Community is formally a unified realm, but actually a single hyper-concentrated capital surrounded by a periphery treated as administrative exile. Every single one of these is the same pattern, repeating at a different scale. A formal structure persisting in name while its actual substance is captured, redirected, and hollowed by private, particularistic interests operating entirely within the rules of the formal structure itself, never needing to break those rules, only to exploit the gaps the rules themselves create. This is what it means to say that a system can fragment without anyone deciding to break it. Nobody in this story is plotting the destruction of the Heian state. The Fujiwara are not trying to topple the emperor. Toppling him would destroy the very mechanism, regency through marriage, that gives them power in the first place. The aristocratic households absorbing tax-exempt estates are not trying to bankrupt the central government. They are simply doing what is locally and individually advantageous, over and over, until the aggregate effect arrives regardless of anyone's individual intentions. This is fragmentation produced by structure, not by conspiracy. Fragmentation as an emergent property of a system whose formal legitimating logic and actual operative logic have drifted permanently apart, with no mechanism inside the system capable of forcing them back together. Because the people most capable of forcing that correction are precisely the people benefiting most from the drift. And this is also, although it lies well beyond the time frame we are dealing with today, the deep structural seed of something that will not become visible for another 2.5 centuries. A slow, cumulative transfer of substantive power away from the center and into private hands eventually produces actors with real, independent military and economic capacity operating at the edges of a state that has lost the administrative depth to discipline them. That is a different story, for a much later moment, involving names like Terra and Minamoto that mean nothing yet in the world the Kokinshu is being compiled in. But the structural precondition for that much later collapse, the hollowing of formal authority by private accumulation operating entirely within the system's own rules, is already fully present, already accelerating, already visible in outline, in the very decades when 4 courtiers are sitting down to assemble an anthology of poems about cherry blossoms and longing. Which is what makes that anthology such a strange and revealing artifact, because it is being produced by exactly the class of people most embedded in, and most benefiting from, the structure we have just walked through. The compilers were not top-tier aristocrats. They were mid-ranking courtiers, men whose actual path to status and patronage ran, in part, through demonstrated skill rather than birth alone, which tells you something important about poetry's strange function inside this otherwise rigidly inherited hierarchy. You could not outrank your blood in Heian Japan. But you could, within certain limits, outright it, and a court increasingly losing its grip on the substantive machinery of administration, taxation, and provincial control, was, at the very same historical moment, perfecting its grip on something it could still fully author. Who counted as a master of beauty? Whose name got remembered? What counted as the official aesthetic identity of the realm? We are going to come back to that idea more than once across this series, because it is going to turn out to be one of the central keys to understanding what the Kokinshu is actually doing, underneath the cherry blossoms and the autumn leaves and the careful, formal sorrow of its love poems. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.